come once again to discuss things.
Hi everyone, welcome to a special episode of Geeky Gentlemen. This is a special installment for Geeky Gentlemen History Month, the month in which we discuss what, Rasco? What do we discuss during Geeky Gentlemen History Month?
The geeky contributions to history that have been ignored by a biased educational system or something like that?
Close enough. Except not at all.
Except not at all.
Indeed. But before we get into everything, I want you, the listener, to know... Kieran, what do I want the listeners to know?
You want listeners to know that now they can listen to Geeky Gentlemen and somewhere in the description below.
That was not very helpful.
Not at all.
You can download episodes of Geeky Gentlemen and listen on the go. There's a link in the description. You can download old episodes of Geeky Gentlemen by request. Just leave a comment on an old episode and I will upload it for you. Resco, how can they find... Oh, no. Fuck you, Resco. Kieran, how can they find... Kieran, how can they find old episodes?
On the playlist.
Indeed. It's a pop quiz right now in Geeky Gentlemen because it's History Month and you're gonna fucking learn something, god damn it.
You gotta know your facts, okay? Get your facts straight.
I don't know, I like to think that this series of videos are at least somewhat educational. But in the fun way.
You got Instructor Ian here with Instructor Kieran and Instructor Raska.
You know, for a while in college I did legit think of changing my major and becoming a history teacher.
There you go.
Yeah. I have an incredible fascination with it. But anyway, Kieran, what are we discussing on this special episode posted on Thanksgiving, the holiday of lies?
Oh yeah, we're time traveling, I forgot about that. So today we are discussing about how history is taught.
Indeed. And this is something I find very interesting because even though I very much liked history class growing up in public education here in the United States, it wasn't until I got to college and I learned how history should be taught that I really became so very aware of how bullshit the way in which history is taught in this country, and from what I've gathered in talking to other people from other parts of the world, in other countries too. So, yeah, I find the way in which we teach history in the public educational level to be kind of disgusting. Kieran, how's history taught over across the pond?
Ooh, alright, this is a story. Okay, so Professor Kieran's got to roll up his sleeves here. So, history taught here is the most randomest, weirdest mishmash of things you'd ever get to know. Like, if you want to study history in this wonderful little country here, wait till college, because you'll have the opportunity to do it in high school. But high school is the utterly worst time to have any kind of history lesson, because they will teach you... The only thing you'll ever take away from it is something you could take away from like a first lesson in a college, which is that history is kind of like based off, obviously, the nurture of what we use today and how important it is. That's literally the only thing you can take away for the entirety of your time, like God knows how long you'll be spending in high school on history. Because everything else is about fucking French Revolution, about the US, and it's about other countries that are not your own, which you would think at the very least you expect other countries being involved, because, you know, we live in one world together here, and we all affect each other in some shape or form, but you think you'd at least learn about your own country's history before anybody else's. Ironically, you don't...
Particularly living in Britain.
Yeah.
You'd think that living in Britain, there's a lot of rich history that you'd get to get more detail on than we do here in American schools. So, you know, we learn about some of the history of the monarchy and, you know, Norman invasion,
I was gonna say,
Norman
a lot of
conquest, all that
fucking
stuff.
Tudor stuff, yeah.
Yeah, but no, like you think you'd get more subtle, rich detail. Like you'd go into each, you'd go into more detail for major monarchs and stuff like that than
Exactly.
we do here in the States. But no,
Or the
apparently
royals, actually learning what the fucking purpose behind them is, and then learning it's bullshit.
Yeah, you'd think you'd learn more about like the history of the aristocracy and not just the royals and all that stuff. But apparently not.
If you want to learn that, you do that you yourself, because they won't fucking teach it you. And then in college, they will teach you Elizabeth Britain history, and then they'll get on to, once again, cross-country history, or the best kind is, at the very least, they will at least give you the option to choose what history you'd like to study. At this point, when I got to college and I was studying history, I had already looked at my own British history at this point, because high school did not provide me with anything. So I didn't really want to do British history, so at the time I studied in Asian history.
Okay, now...
Sorry.
I'm gonna ask Rasco to pitch in here in a second, but I have a sneaking suspicion you were given the same public education of history that I was, roughly. So, I'm gonna say in kindergarten through 5th grade, you got a lot of general stuff. You probably talked about, the big ones, founding of America, Civil War, maybe a little bit about slavery before that, World War I, World War II, and then maybe a little tiny bit of world history, not much else. In middle school, hold on, I'm guessing, you can correct me later if I'm wrong.
Okay.
Middle school, you probably got expanded on that, did maybe a little bit more about the Civil War, did more about World War I, World War II, and did more about world history, particularly with European countries. And I find it funny that we call it world history when it's really just European history, but whatever. And then when you finally got to high school, you got more specialized things where you'd actually start to learn about, Asia. And otherwise just, once again, refined American Revolution, founding of America. You probably got a little bit of that. And then some... finer detail in World War II. Oh, and shit. As I finish saying all that, Rasco drops out of the call. God damn it.
But no, generally, he probably had the same as you.
I mean, that's what I had. That's what I had for public education. I took a couple of elective history courses in high school.
Like mine, it sounded like quite the mishmash, really.
Well, I mean, there were some certain themes, but I took a couple elective courses. I took a class that was just about World War II.
Yeah.
We talked about nothing else but World War II for an entire semester.
Which I think
I took a class called
any class because of how pivotal of a moment that is for everything, for every nation at the time.
And I took another class that was like really, really fun, but very misinformative. It was called This Day in History. Mm-hmm. And it was very misinformative because the professor did not do enough research on his own, so he misinformed us about a lot of things.
Oh, that's wonderful.
But it was just like every day we would, learn like a new fact, or like today blah 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 happened, this singer was born, or this song came out, or this
random
is
pop culture facts.
Yeah, stuff like that, pop culture, and then actual history too.
What are we talking?
City was invaded. I was just talking about some specialized classes. So how did I do though on my approximation of your public school education of history?
Can you go back to middle school and start from there again?
Okay, middle school. Probably more refined on American Revolution, Civil War, a lot of American history. Probably more refinement on World War II, World War I. Maybe a little bit of European history with as it pertained to conquest of America. And then maybe a tiny, tiny bit of Chinese history, probably centered around the Great Wall up until the Cold War in American history. And then high school, more refinement on American conquest of America, more refinement on World War II, probably. Am I close? Maybe a little, and you'd probably get a lot more world history, which would be European history. Is that about right?
Not quite. So, if we go back to, like, elementary school, the thing that was weird about my elementary school was, like, I think... Now, you would not think that Kentucky would be known for good education, but specifically where I live, JCPS is my school district. We had actually a few really good schools. For instance, the high school I went to, it's ranked like it was like top 60 high schools in America. It was a really good high school, and we had a lot of really diverse history classes that we could take. So, like, when I was in high school, I did take a U.S. history class, but it was an AP U.S. history class, but I also took a AP human geography class, and I took a...
Human geography? Like movements of peoples?
It's about, like, it's like a little bit of economics, kind of about, like, city structure, that like how certain cities are laid out and the reasons why, and it was a really interesting class. It's kind of like an entryway into like looking at like
it's a strategy guide for Sims.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I had a world history class where we did a lot of history. It was an AP class. It was a lot of history on a lot of different cultures and civilizations, and we covered a lot of time. But I think you were pretty on with the middle school thing. I had 7th grade, I think, was world history. My 8th grade year was American history, I believe. When I was a 6th grader, I don't know what that class was. I think that might have been like some other class that wasn't a history class. It was really weird. I forget exactly what it was. But it was like a social studies class, but it was kind of like not civics, but it was weird. But I had a really good 5th grade teacher when I did world history in the 5th grade, and I still know this guy to this day. My 5th grade teacher, he was an awesome person. He's really smart, and he was like all about like, hey, look, kids, I'm gonna really teach you some real stuff about American history. And he was a BAMF. He was a badass motherfucker.
You reminded me of like something I haven't thought about in years. So in high school, my freshman year, you had to pick your which classes a couple months in advance you were going to sign up for. And so, like any rational person, there were 2 classes for history offered. One was ancient history, and the other was modern history. Ancient history got up to about 1500, and then modern history was 1500 till present. So, like any rational human being, I selected, I want to be in ancient history class first. But then, they decided, without consulting any of the students, to switch those classes around. Oh. So everyone that signed up for ancient history ended up taking modern history first. And then could go and take ancient history.
Ancient history is so cool.
Yeah, but I will never understand why that seemed like an appropriate move.
Alright, this makes sense. Fuck continuity and chronological order and all that shit.
Well, because a lot of...
Prequel, we're gonna show it to him like a prequel, that's how we'll get him engaged.
Well, that's the thing though, is so much of it, like every history class I've ever taken, before you start talking about what you're going to start talking about, you talk about the stuff that was happening before. The last history class I ever took was in college, and it was all about the 20th century. And you know what we started off talking about? 19th century imperialism.
Yeah.
Because you are fundamentally unable to understand anything that happened in the 20th century without understanding the context for the 19th century. And guess what? Once you really boil down to it, you're unable to understand everything that happened in the 19th century without understanding the 18th century, and so on, and so on, and so on. It's fucking ridiculous. History is built upon itself. Who would know?
Just gotta learn it all. Just go learn it all.
Yeah, but like I find it interesting the way that public school education works, because, and Rasco, you sound like you had a better experience with public school education history.
Better than most, for sure.
Yeah, than I did. And I still think I did alright, but I was intensely interested and would ask questions. Most people don't. I do have a question, though, for you. Did you ever hear at any point any of your history teachers say America is the greatest country on Earth?
Probably not.
Really? Okay.
I mean,
I know I did. And
certainly not my AP US history teacher. He was kind of like, when I was a junior, he was exactly like Ron Swanson from The Office, where or not The Office, Parks and Rec. You know what I'm talking about, Nick Offerman's character.
Yeah.
He was kind of like him, where he was kind of like a small government libertarian type guy, but he really did like history, but he was very upfront about history, and he was just like, yeah, we butchered him. He would just say things like so straight up like that, like that's what happened, and he wouldn't be like rah rah America, like he wasn't that type of guy. But I mean, like I'm sure he probably likes America out of all the countries on Earth. I'm sure he probably likes living in America the most, but he wasn't like the cheerleader of America.
No, it's just I remember I ran into that, and it took me forever to find this strip from the Boondocks, and if I remember, I'll put it up on screen now. 1850. But I'll read it out regardless. It's Huey Freeman sitting in class, and he raises his hand and asks the teacher, Mr. Petrel, are you a co-conspirator in the plot to brainwash my generation into submission, or are you a mere pawn being manipulated by the powers that be? And then there's a panel of Huey just quietly waiting for an answer, and then he leans forward in the final panel. Mr. Pedo, can I interpret your lack of response as a part of a sinister oath of secrecy, or is it just the shock of learning that you are a pawn being manipulated by the powers that be? And so that's kind of the reaction that I've had in thinking about my public school education after getting an actual education in history in college. Mm-hmm. Because I've said this several times throughout History Month. We don't have a lot of ways to prove, historically speaking, that a thing happened. To prove that I had lunch yesterday, you'd have to not only have my account that I had lunch yesterday, but you'd have to have, a receipt. And guess what? I had lunch at my house yesterday, so you cannot, historically speaking, prove I had lunch yesterday.
That's what you think, but I've been spying on you.
Yeah,
Got
probably.
some footage of it, actually.
But so what we can prove historically, you need documentation that backs up a story. And so that's how you should learn history. You should learn history the way that historians learn history, which is based on first-hand accounts. But the way that we teach history in public schools, and this seems consistent between the three of us, is it's large, sweeping accounts of play-by-play of how things happened.
Yeah.
From textbooks.
Yeah.
I didn't hear anyone here say, yeah, we talked about how this document showed this, that, or the other thing. We talk about history as if it's a storybook. And that's a problem. I think the way in which we learn history allows it to have a narrative crafted around it that serves a very particular purpose. I think we, particularly in this country, but Britain's certainly got its rich history of atrocities, I think we gloss over the atrocities and try to show how and highlight more how we've atoned for them. Because I think, at least from my own experience, I know we spent significantly more time talking about the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement than we did talking about slavery and Jim Crow. We mention that they happened, and we talk about some of the conditions, but we don't spend time on those conditions.
Wait,
we talk about how they were solved.
Is that you're talking about that with slavery? That's what it was like?
Yeah. like with slavery, we talked about slavery. We brought slavery up, but we didn't dwell on slavery. We talked about the Civil War.
I had so much. Look, throughout public school, I did a lot on slavery and on Native Americans. Believe it or not, we did so much covering like the Trail of Tears and all the stuff that Andrew Jackson did, but also the Holocaust and slavery. We did so much on that, like so many times throughout all of my public school years, and I think that might actually be because my city is like a city that has like, I guess, like black historical significance because Muhammad Ali's from here. So we have like some like weird kind of like civil rights streak thing going on in like our education system where we focus a lot on that for some reason here.
Good.
But that's just like a random like specific thing about my city though.
Yeah, so it's like very particular.
It's
but
nowhere else in Kentucky. Everywhere else in Kentucky has terrible education. Horrible.
Yeah, and so you, from your interactions with other people, do you think that what I'm talking about is something that you've witnessed from interacting with other people and how they learned history then?
Yeah, that's definitely the case. I think that like we don't learn history in like a practical use way either. Like, you know, like we always talk about like, oh, you know, the reason that we learn history is so that we can learn from the past and, you know, and that can help us like, you know, make better decisions in the present. So our future can be better. But you know what we don't do in history classes? We don't talk about how we can practically apply what we've learned. Like, you can learn so much about like the stability of a nation through like the fall of like the Roman Empire.
Yep.
And stuff like that.
It's funny, I was doing a live comic review show and I was like, I'll take some questions just to pad out some time here. And someone goes, like, he was totally joking, but I gave him, like, a legit answer. What is your opinion on the fall of the Roman Empire? And so I gave him, like, a legit answer in, like, 2 minutes. Anyway, go on, I'm sorry.
But yeah, like, there's so much there you can, like, use and apply to what we're seeing today in a lot of countries when it comes to, like, borders and stuff like that and the Roman Empire and, like, infighting within and stuff like that. There's a lot of, like, cool little things where you can like say like, oh, let's look at this and like let's apply that. How does this match up to what's going on today? And like, can we like try to predict what might happen if certain things aren't addressed in a certain manner? Like, you can learn so much from history, but we don't really focus on that as much as we just learn about it. Like, we just got to cover it so you know what happened. And even then, certain things are emphasized less or more depending on where you live. I mean, there are states in America today that do teach slavery where it was like the slaves were, you know, they just went to America. Like, they don't talk about it like it was they were enslaved partially by, you know, African slavers, but also the white man were the ones that were buying it, so they created the demand. So, I mean, like, you don't learn about all of that stuff. You learn, like, oh, yeah, the slaves just came to America, and they just did the work in America. Like, that's how history is taught in some areas in the U.S.
You know, it's really interesting.
That's messed up.
Yeah, you ever heard of the comedian Chelsea Lately?
Yes, actually, yeah.
She has a documentary series that she did on Netflix, and she's kind of the most perfect person to address some of this shit, because she was talking about racism in the country, and she's just such, like, not stupid, but she's not a very knowledgeable person. She's you know, kind of witty and stuff, but she's obviously not an incredibly knowledgeable person. So she's really the perfect person because she's more or less a blank slate for a lot of this stuff. She did an episode all about racism and went down to the South, and at one point, she's actually reading from a history book from, like, the 1950s. And I'm trying to remember the exact wording of it, because that's another thing I find interesting, is the way in which it's taught and the way it has evolved. Because I will admit, it's gotten better. She's reading from a history book from a southern school in the 1950s, and it's like, now we move on to one of the most quaint times in southern history, the plantation life. You can imagine yourself as a young plantation owner's child, and you would come downstairs where your Mammy would be serving you breakfast and you could go play out in the fields all day. Well, you know why? It's because you weren't doing any of the fucking work. It was the slaves. That's the fucked up part. It's like, yeah, of course you didn't have to do any work. You can go play out in the fields all day. There's fucking slaves to do everything for you.
Fun.
Uh-huh. So the idea of how the past is taught is, I think, very, very important if we want to learn from it. We have to address why it was a problem in the first place. But just the idea of how people are taught and how we gloss over things and focus on the solutions, is it any surprise that we have people who think that this isn't a problem anymore? Like, that's why I think it is important to focus on the issue more than the solution. Because people have it in their heads, racism's over. And that's not the case. I'm sorry, I feel like I'm jumping all over the place. Did any of that connect and make any sense at all?
Yeah, I mean...
Oh, okay.
Racism can never truly be over in the sense that, like, there's always going to be, like, some random person that is a racist. And that's, you know, that's just, like, a thing that is just kind of a sucky thing about reality. And so...
If you choose to accept it, yeah.
Well, I mean, there's always just the chance that, like, there's some random guy, even in, like, a culture that's, like, evolved past, like, even if in, like, a million years, it's possible there's just some random guy who's just like, I really just don't like those kind of people, and that's horrible and messed up, and, you know, those people suck.
Yeah, I don't know. It's just, I find that whole idea of focusing on these sweeping narratives and focusing on the ways in which they were solved more than the problem in and of itself creates a real problem and a kind of disconnect, because I think part of it is just Heidegger principle of reason. We like the answer more than we do the question. We're kind of, you know, we're dumb monkeys that are trained to search for a solution as opposed to dwelling on a problem. And while that has a very practical purpose, it's very useful, dwelling on the problem, there's something to be said for. Sometimes I think you do benefit from just sitting with a thing and trying your best to comprehend it, as opposed to just moving past it because it's not the issue it was anymore. Trying to think of a good example. Disease. We still study smallpox and other diseases even though we have the potential to make them extinct. Like, smallpox is a disease that no longer exists in the world, but it is still an active virus that is kept alive in labs, so it can be studied. So, like, we have the potential to shut it down and only focus on the fact that we found a solution to it.
It just never happens.
I mean, we could. I just think that there is something to be said for studying the problem in and of itself.
At the base form, just kind of look at what the problem is, like identifying the issue.
Yeah, and just try to understand it from as many facets as possible.
Like, for why is it a problem to begin with?
Yeah, what made that problem arise? And that's why I think, you know, focusing on the sweeping narrative, which is what is done by and large in this country, is a problem. And Kieran, you pretty much indicated the same, that it's just, sweeping narratives and very little focus on our own history.
That's kind of the main problem I find within you. It's kind of like a problem with yours as well. It's just lack of focus, lack of passion in the teachers as well. Sometimes, like, you get some ones that are properly into it, but and even then they're unfortunately, you know, stuck teaching history about this country now, switch to this country. They never get a chance to focus on individual basis and have a proper analytical discussion. That they have to keep swapping lessons from this to this to this, and then eventually just culminating in World War II.
Yeah, and it bothers me that we took standardized tests. Every year that I was in school, I'd take a standardized test, and it was math and English. Math and English, math and English, math and English, reading comprehension, mathematical skills.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we focus more on knowing our history? Why isn't that history and science? But seriously,
Because
why is history not important enough to standardize?
Because it's happened already. That's why.
Yeah, and that's terrible. Just because it's happened, well, why did it happen?
Yeah.
What led to that situation? Why was that at any point in time considered okay?
And from their education system, not right, but from their education system, the idea is, well, that asking those questions and learning the answers won't help you when you go get a job or whatever you do. So it doesn't really matter. So put much stock into it.
Yeah, and that's terrible. Is this idea of, well, history? There's no jobs for history besides historian.
Yeah.
And that might be true, but why? This is where we get into the whole
Why don't they push for it more?
Yeah, this is where we get into the whole fuck capitalism thing. But if you're valuing knowledge only on its basis to be able to produce profit, you have a seriously fucked up view of the world, in my opinion.
Pretty much.
The idea that knowledge for knowledge's sake is somehow worthless just baffles me. And maybe that's because I'm a philosophy student. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that knowledge is worthless is scary to me. It creates a feeling of dismissiveness to being an intellectual. And while I can agree, a country of people who don't know how to do anything besides read and talk about really high-minded stuff is a country that's not going to go anywhere. The idea that it's worthless to know these things about your past scares me.
Mm-hmm.
Rasco, where's your take on all this?
I
put you on the spot.
I really admire when people are just have a passion and a pursuit for more knowledge just because it's, I don't know, I guess it's just important to the human experience. I mean, you should try to learn as much as you can in the time that you have just to better understand your existence as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Nice.
Yeah.
Nice one. Yeah, I agree. I feel like knowledge is a pursuit worth going for just in and of itself. But that's not incredibly related to the topic at hand here. I don't know, man. History is such a... I think maybe the reason that we don't focus on the problems themselves and instead focus on these big sweeping things is it's easier to test, when did this battle occur, when was this king in power or whatever, than it is to test someone's comprehension of this event, right?
Mm.
It's easier to test someone's ability to tell you World War I lasted from... Shit, I'm gonna stop. See, it's so funny. I love history. I have such a shit mind for names and dates. When did this... World War I lasted from 1914 to 1918. I hope to God I got that right. It's easier to test that knowledge than it is to test what was the psychological understanding of trench warfare. What was the problem with that type of warfare and what kind of toll it took on people? That's one of those two is a much more interesting question. How long did World War I last? What was the toll that trench warfare took on
Answer that question.
the
I want to
soldiers?
know the answer. Answer it.
Answer the question of what was the toll?
Yeah.
Read Hemingway. There's your answer.
I'm so enlightened now.
Right? Like the idea that you can just easily test broad sweeping knowledge,
Yeah.
but you can't really test someone's comprehension of an event. Is part of why we teach to the idea of the narrative. But I think that's a problem, and I also want to talk more about the idea of indoctrination. The idea of self-serving history. Yeah, we did bad things, but we're better now. Is not an acceptable argument in my mind. I don't think the crimes of the past are escapable. And I think that one of the few things you can do to make up for the crimes of the past is to be aware of them. And not gloss over and forget about them.
I think that in public education, you should be required to to learn more about politics in general, because something that, people don't like this reality, but it's a reality. The reason that we had such a horrible election this year with two candidates that are the two most disliked presidential candidates in U.S. American history, the reason was because people just become so politically apathetic, and it's because we don't talk about like political ideology at like the real deeper level. We talk about it on such like a surface glossy level, and it's really, we have such a narrow view of a political spectrum. We have such like a narrow view of like what political ideas we like bring forth and discuss and investigate. And like because of that, that's not how history has been. Because if you think about like people of history, politics was more like the longer we've gone on as a society, the less involved politics have been in people's lives, right? Like people in the founding of America, the concept of like government and like role of government and like the specifics of how their government was laid out and checks and balances, like this was a big aspect of the American people's lives, and it's become less and less of a thing that we discuss on an actual like let's talk about big ideas level as we've gone on. Like we just kind of like push that out. I hear so many people like, oh, I'm so glad the election's over, now we can stop talking about politics. And it's like, well, no, don't you understand? That's the exact reason why we had this election. It's because we don't talk about politics.
I wouldn't say that we don't talk about politics. I think the issue
the mainstream
is
media does a shit job of facilitating discussion on a national level.
Yeah, that's the thing is it puts politics into a false dichotomy, and it ruins the idea of a nuanced view. And I agree. I think that I think just generally we should do more to make people be involved in politics. I really like Australia's law that Ozzy Griffin told us about. I really like the idea you can be fined for not voting.
It bothers me. Like I don't want just like random dumbasses that have nothing to that have no nuanced opinion voting, really, if I'm being honest. But at the same time, I would take a really educated population having a lot more voters over what we have now. Like I want people to have opinions and talk about them, and at the end of the day, like actually follow through and go and do what they say they support. Actually support it. Like Kanye West just came out and says, I would have voted Trump if I voted. I'm like, okay, well, fuck you, Kanye West. Get out your fucking ass and vote, you son of a bitch.
How, Kanye West? Oh.
Even if you're in California, your vote wouldn't have really mattered. But, like, even if you're going to say that, like, actually go out and vote, you motherfucker. Don't talk about what you would have done had you voted. Get out there and do it.
Kanye is a fucking idiot.
He is. I'm not going to disagree. I don't like Kanye West, but
Yeah. Um, yeah, I agree. I like the idea of trying to get people more involved. You know, I loved the show The West Wing, and it did get a little ridiculous at points, but there was one episode where an idea was floated, and, like, they took the time to really show how ridiculous some ideas were and then try to give you the best possible version of those ideas. Like, the committee to stop the racial colonialism of maps was a thing that popped up in that show at one point. And it was just about how the fact that the way we portray the world on maps is based in imperialistic dogma. And in fact, you know, like, as evidenced by the fact that Africa and Greenland look to be about the same size on most world map. Africa and Greenland look to be about the same size, when in fact Africa should be like 4 times bigger.
Yeah, I know exactly. I know what you're talking about. Where like it's important.
It should be upside down and left to right and all this other shit, but it's like we don't do that because we can't think of the world that way. But regardless of that,
I like it.
Yeah. There's all these like things that show would point out that it was just it sounded batshit crazy, and then it would give you the best possible version for that argument. And one of the things that it did was make a really, really good case for the idea that children should be able to vote. And, you know, you hear that idea, and you go, no, they shouldn't. That's silly.
That's stupid.
Yeah, but at the same time, watch the episode where they talk about that, dude. It's some very compelling arguments.
Children's got rights, too.
Well, the idea that children would have a unique perspective on things that would, say, raise the national debt. Children would have a unique perspective on minimum wage laws. Children would have unique perspectives on environmental concerns.
Are these perspectives you really gonna want?
Yeah, and then there's the idea that, and like counter arguments go, well, children don't have the understanding to be responsible, and yada yada yada. The problem is, every counter argument you can throw at the idea of children voting is something that was thrown at like other marginalized groups not being able to vote. Like, children don't have the understanding. Niggers don't have the understanding to be able to vote. It's this really interesting thing where it puts you in a very, very tight space of how you can argue with that point. Because you realize who you're in company with very quickly, and it's a very dangerous group. But yeah, I do like the idea of trying to more heavily show the consequences of political decisions in the classroom. How do you feel about the idea of dropping narrative textbooks and looking at more first-hand accounts of history?
I'm all for it, man. I'll say go all in.
Kieran? Kieran? I think Kieran fell asleep.
Nope, I'm
Kieran, how do you feel about the idea of doing more first-hand accounts of history in classrooms?
It'd be better off than what we have.
Yeah?
It would be more direct, more to the point, it'd be more engaging.
Mm-hmm.
It'd stop beating around the bush, more or less. And that's kind of my main problem with it. Doesn't really it's kind of like a dangling cat. It gets you enough to maybe get you interested, but not enough beyond that. And that's kind of a problem. Like, everything also should get you interested in it, by all means, but it should have enough to it to provide, to actually want to study it. But no, it just kind of gives you enough to just, maybe pursue it on your own, but nothing for the actual, facilities at the education either be college or high school or anything itself.
Mm-hmm.
Which is flawed.
Yeah, I agree. It's a really good way. Like, I love the academic approach to learning history. Is you only, it's very scientific, which is totally fair if you want someone to take it seriously. I think the scientific method, generally speaking, is a pretty good approach.
Mm-hmm.
Only what you can prove happened. You take first-hand accounts, but only first-hand accounts that can be supported by proof. Roughly speaking, you can take some first-hand accounts that don't have, documents proving X, Y, and Z happened. But they have to obviously match with factual event too. Like, you can take a first-hand account of soldiers storming a town, even if you don't have the written orders for those soldiers or whatever, but you can't take a first-hand account of fucking Jesus showing up to stop a dinosaur.
Jesus showing up to stop a dinosaur.
Like, what you have to have is something that matches with fact.
Yeah.
So I like that approach better. I like the idea of learning history through the eyes of those who were there, like through reading letters corresponding between things. And that was some of the best history that I did on occasion get a little bit of that. Like, it would slip through mostly in documentaries that we would watch, which, goddamn, that's a problem too. But I did occasionally get that. Like, I remember we were watching this one documentary about Nazis in America before World War II. And one of them had a reading of a letter a guy in Germany sent to his pen pal in America. And it was all about how great everything was now that there were no more Jews. And it ended with, when will America start getting rid of its Jews? Bye.
Talk to you later.
Like, that's the...
It's sad that that's more or less how it goes.
No, but that's the best window into the attitude that was had at the time.
Oh,
It's a perfectly valid question, I think.
Signed, Steve Bannon. Zing!
You know what? I just, he just had to ask. It's a question.
Yeah.
Just throwing it out there.
Mm-hmm. No, but like I found that to be a really good one. And there was also one we watched that was like, it was just a bunch of letters back and forth between people during the Revolutionary War, and one was like, again, it just shows you a window into these people's heads. This was I remember watching in middle school. It was a slave owner writing out the description of a slave that ran away to go fight with the British against the Americans in the Revolutionary War, because the British would grant freedom to any Africans that fought with them, African slaves that fought with them. Like, okay, run away from your masters, join the British Army, and we'll grant you your freedom after we win the war. So this guy, the slave owner, wrote a letter describing his runaway slave for anyone that found him to, like, bring him back and board him. And he's like, honestly, I'm not mad at him. I just want him back home safe. He looks like this. I'm completely shocked that he would run away and join the British. Just this, it gives you a very, very particular window into how people think, or how people of the time think. And what's really interesting is we always talk about this idea of, oh, well, we can learn from history so we don't repeat it. No one is ever going to do the exact same things move by move by move that happened in history. But what you can find are these similar patterns of thinking, and you can start pointing them out, and that can help shut something down, I believe. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe I'm 100% right with this election.
God knows at
Perhaps.
this point.
Well, like I talked about this in one of the recent episodes, how the Nazis never had a majority in the German parliament after World War One. They never had a majority. They were just able to obstruct stuff enough that nothing was able to get done, and eventually they were able to grab power. Sound fucking familiar?
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's definitely things to be learned from history, and I like the idea. I was very profoundly impacted by
I think the
first-hand account stuff.
I think the implications alone are just kind of fascinating when it comes to history.
Okay, well, I want to go for a couple more minutes so we get an hour out of this.
Is Rasco still here? Because I haven't heard his lovely voice in a bit.
Rasco? Hello?
Oh,
Guys,
I have my mic muted. I'm sorry.
It's cool. I don't know, Rasco, what is something you would like to see done more? Or actually, no, you already talked about more politics. Kieran, what's something you would like to see introduced more in history classes, besides, like, encouraging kids to get involved in politics or doing more first-hand account stuff?
Passion in teaching it, but not just necessarily like getting teachers that are really excited about teaching it, like oh guys, we're going to do history day, like planning out lessons or getting teachers that are really passionate about teaching it, and make it fun, make it interesting, because you have like opposite side of the spectrum with the very simplistic nature of typical teenagers, high school kids find history boring, which is kind of at least somewhat of a fair argument, because considering how really piss poor they're planned, considering that, well, you don't really need to know what happened then, because that's not going to help you go get a job when you graduate from school. So they don't put that much stock into the planning. More effort, more passion put into how everything's planned, I think would get more people interested, more enthusiasm, and then, we could actually, see some actual focus and some good lessons going on.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I like the idea of trying to encourage,
if not for our generation of clerics, it's it's been and gone, but for future ones, so then we can, so they can at least, like we said before, look up events that, it was worth knowing about.
I agree. I think that there's a real problem in the idea of teaching for tests as opposed to teaching for the sake of it.
Teaching for knowledge.
Yeah. Rasco, your thoughts on that?
I don't really have anything to add.
Okay.
I agree.
Okay, do we have anywhere else we can go? Can we get like 6 more minutes out of this?
Okay, what can we talk about?
Oh, okay, I got an idea. Like, we've been pretty negative on things. Let's talk about something that a moment that we had in a history class during public school education that was very, very impactful, that you thought was taught well.
Okay.
Rasco, you go first.
Oh God, I don't want to go first. Does somebody have one in mind?
I can do one, that's fine. I know very little about this outside of this one lesson, but it's something that really stuck with me. I had a teacher in high school, and he's the guy I took the World War I class with, and I also took another history class with them. It was American history. And no other history class ever taught me the history of how Hawaii became a state, but he was Hawaiian.
Oh, that's
and
awesome.
So he took the time to do a whole day I'm talking about Hawaii becoming a state. And it's fucked, y'all. It's straight fucked, y'all. It's like the worst thing ever. Again. So much shit in American history. Like a fucking capitalist. Like it's the most. It's just hands down the best argument for communism ever. Like a capitalist just set up shop on the Hawaiian Islands and started growing pineapples there. And then they the Queen of Hawaii went to America to go visit, and while she was gone, the dude staged a coup and took over the islands, and then the American government, of course, oh, it's terrible, you have to give it up, otherwise we won't associate with you, yada yada. And then just within a couple of years, no one significant died or anything. Just within a couple of years, they decided, well, okay, well, never mind. It's cool.
It's cool.
Yeah, you're cool. You're a colony now. It was so fucked. Like, everything about it was so fucked up.
Such the utter definition of getting the short straw.
Yeah, and so it's just this, very, very impactful lesson from someone who experienced, or who had a connection to it. And so he was very passionate about the idea, about what happened there. And, just again, really, really good class, and that's one that always stuck with me. Now it's on you, Rasco.
Okay. Here's a good story. So when I was in my junior year of high school, my teacher, I talked about him earlier. He was kind of like Ron Swanson from Parks and Rec. We did this thing where he did these really cool debates where he would divide our class into two teams, and he would go to historical, huge historical paradigm shifts, and we would have debates. So for example, one of them was half the class was the colonists and half the class was Britain, and it was a final debate before America would go to war and try to start a revolution. And it was half of us had to debate why we felt this was necessary, and then the English would debate well, no, we think you're unreasonable because of this, and you had to fight for your side in this class debate, and it was really cool. And we all had specific historical figures that we were supposed to represent, and we had to learn about and try to argue from their specific political ideology.
Did anyone do King George and then started singing "You'll Be Back"?
No, but someone.
There's a reference for the curious low. There you go.
Yeah, I just remember that was really fun, and that was really cool, and it was really fun because you don't typically get a hardcore argument from why the British would potentially think that America was in the wrong in that case, and it was just actually cool to get.
Totally fucking were. It's ridiculous.
And it was just really fun to actually get that perspective because of the situation. So it was cool.
Okay, how about you, Kieran?
One moment where it kind of stood out to me was, ironically, that's kind of the lesson that I always complain about because it's always kind of the focus point of every class, but it's important enough, obviously, to learn about in some shape or form. It's when my tutor was talking about World War II, and I found everything he talked about fascinating. He wasn't entirely into it himself, but everything he talked about, from how each side planned out their strategies, what motivations were some of the leaders going behind, what was happening to those who were captured, what was going on to the territory that was being captured. I found all of that fascinating, and how much different it did from how army tactics went around this day and age in war. Where the political side go into it, and how does that affect the actual militaristic side of it, and is there really that much of a difference between it back then, how it worked now, kind of how Hitler's kind of roll round up, going up and down the country of the Jews, of course, kind of geographically mapping that out. I thought was just great. I thought it was fascinating. Of course, then you get the political side of this country's waiting in, to help. This country's going in there to engage and to help. This country's just staying there waiting to fucking make the planes and whatnot. And I found that just really fascinating.
Another thing that occurs to me, and I can't believe I almost didn't mention this, we did actually have a veteran of World War II come in to class and just talk about his experiences a couple times, and that was really interesting.
How was that?
Yeah, it was like he got, at one point, he was captured and actually escaped, so he was behind enemy lines.
Shield.
Yeah, that happened. No, he was behind enemy lines, and he had to, kind of sneak across the European countryside to get back to, the American front. And, like, my favorite story of his, he's probably dead now, which is weird to think about, but my favorite story of his was, he and the guy that he escaped with got all the way to the line, but then they had to figure out how to get across it because it's the fucking battle line. It's heavily defended, right?
Yeah.
So the best thing that they could think to do was to just run across the field holding out their dog tags to show that they were Americans.
Oh, God.
Yeah! So they're getting shot at the whole time until they got close enough.
Well,
yeah.
that was definitely something.
Just interesting little thing. Yeah, I don't know.
That was a nice little story.
Yeah, it was cool to, like, again, first-hand accounts are always really fascinating. He apparently broke security protocol, too, by including a secret code in his letters to his fiancée about where he was in the country. That was kind of interesting to find out. Yeah. Oh, well. I think that'll do it for this week's for this special episode of Geeky Gentlemen. Everyone, thank you very much for watching. Kieran, thank you for being here. I can only imagine how late it is for you right now.
It's just hit 6 in the morning.
Nice. Alright. That'll do it, everyone. Thanks very much for watching. Until next time, I'm the Philosopher.
You can't see, but I'm waving my hands at you, Rasker.
And I'm the Legend of Elm Street, McCurry.
And I'm the Wandering Samurai.
And we are your Geeky Gentlemen, and we will be discussing things.
Thank you.